The Rio Grande roared like a wounded beast, its muddy waters swollen from the sudden downpour that had torn through the Arizona territory that morning. Jake Morrison wiped the rain from his eyes, squinting through the grey curtain that had turned his weekly supply run into a treacherous journey back to his ranch. His horse Chester snorted nervously as they approached the usually calm crossing point. The river, normally knee-deep, now churned with debris, fallen branches, tumbleweeds, and the occasional unfortunate jackrabbit caught in nature's fury. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, patting Chester's neck. At 32, Jake had weathered plenty of flash floods in his 8 years working this harsh land, but something felt different about this one. The air crackled with an energy that made his skin prickle. That's when he heard it, a desperate cry cutting through the storm's howl. Jake's blue eyes scanned the raging water until he spotted her, a woman massive in stature, struggling against the current about 50 yards downstream. Her long black hair whipped around her face as she fought to keep her head above the churning surface. Even from this distance, Jake could see she was losing the battle. Without hesitation, he spurred Chester toward the riverbank. The woman was Apache. He could tell from her buckskin dress and the distinctive silver ornaments that caught the dim light. In these parts, that meant trouble. The uneasy peace between the white settlers and the Apache had been strained for months, with rumors of young warriors growing restless under their chief's restraint. But Jake Morrison had never been one to let fear override his conscience. He quickly assessed the situation. The woman was being swept toward a cluster of jagged rocks that jutted from the water like broken teeth. She had maybe 2 minutes before the current would dash her against them. "Hold on!" he shouted, though he doubted she could hear him over the storm. Jake shrugged off his heavy coat and kicked off his boots. Chester whinnied in protest as his master dove into the frigid, violent water. The current immediately grabbed Jake, pulling him downstream faster than he'd anticipated. His muscles screamed against the cold as he fought to angle toward the struggling woman. She was enormous, easily 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. Her dark eyes, wide with panic, locked onto his as he drew closer. For a moment, suspicion flickered across her face. An Apache woman saved by a white man was unprecedented in these parts. "Trust me," Jake gasped, water filling his mouth as he reached for her. Their hands met, just as her strength gave out. Her weight nearly pulled him under, but Jake had spent years hauling cattle and wrestling stubborn steers. He wrapped his arm around her chest and began the desperate swim toward shore, fighting not just the current, but the cultural chasm that made this rescue as dangerous as the flood itself. The woman, Ayana, though Jake didn't know her name yet, had stopped struggling, whether from exhaustion or the realization that this white stranger was her only hope. She allowed him to guide them both toward a small inlet where the current ran slower. Jake's lungs burned as his feet finally found purchase on the muddy bottom. Together they stumbled onto the bank, collapsing in the wet grass as the storm continued to rage around them. Both were gasping, shivering, alive. Ayana pushed herself up on her elbows, studying Jake's face with intelligent, dark eyes. She was beautiful in a fierce, untamed way, her features strong and proud, her presence commanding even in her vulnerable state. She spoke in Apache, words Jake couldn't understand, but whose tone suggested both gratitude and wariness. "You're safe now," Jake said simply, knowing she probably understood more English than she spoke. She nodded slowly, then did something that surprised him. She placed her hand over her heart and then extended it toward him, a gesture of thanks that transcended language. As they caught their breath, Jake noticed the elaborate beadwork on her dress, the quality of the silver at her throat. This wasn't just any Apache woman. The craftsmanship spoke of high status, possibly even nobility within her tribe. "Jake Morrison," he said, pointing to himself. "Ayana," she replied, her voice deep and melodious despite her exhaustion. The rain was beginning to ease, but Jake knew the danger was far from over. Apache search parties would be looking for her soon, and finding her in the company of a white man would raise questions that could shatter the fragile peace both communities desperately needed. As if reading his thoughts, Ayana pointed toward the mountains, where smoke signals were already beginning to rise through the clearing clouds. Her people knew she was missing. Jake helped her to her feet, noting how she towered over his own 6-foot frame. Chester had found his way to them and stood waiting patiently, his reins dragging in the mud. "Can you ride?" Jake asked. Ayana nodded, accepting his help to mount behind him. As they rode toward his ranch, neither spoke of the consequences that might follow this rescue. Neither mentioned the stories both their peoples told about what happened when the two worlds collided. But as the sun began to set through the breaking clouds, painting the sky the color of fresh blood, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that saving Ayana's life might have just sealed his own fate. The smoke signals continued to multiply across the distant peaks, carrying news that would reach Chief Naalnish within hours. His daughter had been saved by a white man and by Apache law that created a debt that could only be settled by the gathering of warriors. The Morrison ranch sat in a valley between two ridges, a modest spread of grazing land with a sturdy log cabin, a barn, and a corral that Jake had built with his own hands. As they rode through the gate, Ayana's sharp eyes took in every detail: the defensive positioning, the clear lines of sight, the way the buildings were arranged to provide cover in case of attack. Jake helped her down from Chester, noting how she moved despite her ordeal, with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to danger. Her buckskin dress had dried during the ride, but her long black hair still hung in damp strands around her shoulders. "You need dry clothes and warm food," Jake said, gesturing toward the cabin. Ayana shook her head, pointing toward the mountains where more smoke signals had appeared. The messages were becoming more frequent, more urgent. She spoke in Apache, her tone grave. "I don't understand," Jake admitted. She switched to broken English, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "My people, they come. You—" She struggled for the words, then touched her chest and his in turn. "Bound now, Apache way." Jake's stomach tightened. He'd heard stories from other ranchers about Apache customs, about debts of honor that could span generations. "What kind of bound?" Before Ayana could answer, the distant sound of war drums began echoing across the valley. The rhythmic beating carried on the evening air like a heartbeat of the earth itself. Ayana's expression grew more troubled. "My brother Takoda," she said. "He is angry warrior. Our father, Chief Naalnish, he tried to keep peace. But Takoda—" She made a slashing motion with her hand. Jake understood. Hot-headed young warriors were the same in any culture, and if this Takoda was anything like some of the cowboys Jake knew, saving his sister might be seen as an insult rather than a kindness. "How long do we have?" Jake asked. Ayana looked at the smoke signals, counting them with practiced eyes. "Sunrise. Maybe 200 warriors." 200. Jake felt his mouth go dry. He was one man with a Winchester rifle, a Colt 45, and whatever ammunition he had in the cabin. Even if he could hold them off, which was impossible, it would mean war between the Apache and every white settlement within 100 miles. "Why sunrise?" he asked. "Apache way," Ayana explained. "Challenge must come with new light. Father will speak first. If you show respect—" She shrugged, a gesture that suggested his chances were slim. As if to emphasize the point, more drums joined the first, creating a complex rhythm that seemed to come from all directions. Jake realized they were already surrounded, though by how many warriors he couldn't tell. Inside the cabin, Jake lit an oil lamp and began preparing what might be his last meal. Ayana sat at his rough-hewn table, studying him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Despite the language barrier, he could feel her trying to understand what kind of man had risked his life for a stranger. "Why?" she asked suddenly. Jake paused in his preparation of coffee and beans. "Why what? Why save me? Apache and white man?" She made opposing gestures with her hands. Jake considered the question as he stirred the fire in his stone hearth. "My mother always said, a life is a life. Color of skin doesn't change that." Ayana was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your mother, she was wise woman. She was. Died of fever when I was 20, but she taught me right from wrong before she passed. My mother also dead," Ayana said softly. "Killed by soldiers when I was girl. That is why Takoda so angry. Why many young warriors want war." The drums continued their ominous rhythm as Jake served them both coffee and beans. They ate in companionable silence, two people from different worlds, sharing what might be their last peaceful moments. As the night deepened, Jake found himself studying Ayana more closely. She was unlike any woman he'd ever met, white or Apache. There was a strength about her that went beyond her impressive physical stature, an intelligence that shone in her eyes, and despite the circumstances, a gentleness in how she moved and spoke. "Tell me about your father," Jake said. "This Chief Naalnish." Ayana's expression softened slightly. "He is good man, wise leader. He knows war bring only death for our people. But," she gestured toward the mountains, "pressure from young warriors grows strong. They say peace make Apache weak." "And what do you say?" "I say—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. Wisdom sometimes looks like weakness to those who only know strength, but true strength is knowing when not to fight. Jake nodded. He'd met men like that in the war, leaders who understood that sometimes the hardest thing was restraint. Around midnight, the drums fell silent. The sudden absence of sound was more unnerving than the beating had been. Ayanna stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. "They are here," she said simply. Jake joined her at the window. At first, he saw nothing but the moonlit valley. Then, gradually, his eyes began to pick out shapes in the darkness, warriors positioned on the ridges behind rocks near the tree line. They had moved with absolute silence, surrounding the ranch house like ghosts. 200, Jake asked. Ayanna shook her head grimly. More. They stood together at the window, watching the silent siege take shape around them. Jake realized that every warrior had probably been in position for hours, waiting with the patience of men who understood that sunrise would bring either justice or war. "What will your father want?" Jake asked. "To understand why white man risk life for Apache woman," Ayanna replied. "To judge if you are enemy or," she struggled with the word, "ally." "And your brother?" Ayanna's jaw tightened. "Takoda will want blood. He believes only death can restore honor." As the first faint glow of dawn began to creep over the eastern ridge, Jake made a decision that would determine not just his fate, but the future of peace between two peoples. "When your father comes," Jake said, "I want you to translate exactly what I say, no matter how it sounds, no matter what it means for Apache custom. Can you do that?" Ayanna studied his face in the lamplight. After a long moment, she nodded. "I will speak your words truly." Outside, the sound of horses moving could be heard, not the thundering charge of an attack, but the measured pace of a formal approach. Dawn was breaking, and Chief Naalnish was coming to determine whether Jake Morrison was a man worthy of the debt his daughter's life had created. The siege was about to become a trial, and Jake's life hung in the balance of words yet unspoken. The sun crested the eastern ridge like a golden eye opening on the world, casting long shadows across Jake's ranch. As the light touched the valley floor, the true scope of the Apache presence became clear. Warriors lined every ridge, filled every gully, and stood behind every rock and tree. Jake had never seen so many armed men in one place, not even during the war. 3 riders approached the cabin with ceremonial dignity. Chief Naalnish rode in the center, an older man whose weathered face spoke of decades leading his people through impossible choices. His gray-streaked hair was adorned with eagle feathers, and his buckskin clothing bore intricate beadwork that marked his status. To his right rode a man who could only be Takoda, younger, powerfully built, with fury radiating from him like heat from a forge. The third was an elderly warrior whose scars and missing left eye testified to a lifetime of battles. "Remember," Ayanna whispered to Jake as they stepped onto the porch, "show respect, but do not bow. Apache respect strength, not submission." Jake nodded, his Winchester resting against the doorframe, visible but not threatening. As the 3 riders dismounted, he noticed how Takoda's hand never strayed far from his tomahawk, while the chief's weathered hands remained calm at his sides. Chief Naalnish spoke in Apache, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. The words echoed across the valley, and Jake realized the chief was addressing not just him, but all the warriors watching from their positions. Ayanna translated quietly. "He says, the morning brings questions that must be answered. He asks why a white man would risk his life for an Apache woman when our people stand on the edge of war." Jake stepped forward, meeting the chief's dark eyes directly. "Tell him I saved her, because it was right. A person drowning is just a person drowning, not Apache, not white, just someone who needed help." Ayanna spoke Jake's words in Apache. The chief listened impassively, but Jake caught a slight narrowing of his eyes. Whether approval or suspicion, he couldn't tell. Takoda, however, spat in the dust and spoke angrily. "My brother says you lie," Ayanna translated, her voice strained. "He says white men only help when they want something in return. He asks what you want from our people." "Nothing," Jake replied, keeping his gaze on the chief. "I want nothing but to live in peace on my land and raise my cattle." This time, when Ayanna translated, Takoda's response was a harsh bark of laughter. He spoke rapidly, gesturing toward Jake with obvious contempt. "He says peace is a word white men use when they want Apache to be weak," Ayanna said reluctantly. "He says you saved me to make our father feel he owes you something." Jake felt his own temper rising but forced it down. Losing his cool now would get them all killed. Instead, he addressed his next words directly to Takoda, though he knew Ayana would have to translate. "Tell your brother, I've been on this land for 8 years. In that time I've never taken anything that wasn't mine. I've never harmed an Apache. I've never broken any treaty or promise. Yesterday, I saw someone in trouble, and I helped. If that makes me his enemy, then he's decided to be my enemy for doing what's right." The old scarred warrior spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly with age. Ayana translated, "Naiche says Jake Morrison speaks like a warrior, but words are wind. He asks what proof you offer that your heart is true." This was the moment Jake had been preparing for all night. He walked slowly to where his Winchester leaned against the door, aware that 200 weapons were trained on him. Instead of picking up the rifle, he lifted it and held it out toward Chief Naalnish. "Tell them," Jake said, "that I offer my weapon as proof. An Apache daughter was in danger, and I helped her. If that creates a debt, then it's a debt of honor between honorable people. But I won't live as a prisoner on my own land, and I won't apologize for doing what's right." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake could hear his own heartbeat as Chief Naalnish considered the offered rifle. Around the valley, he sensed rather than saw the shifting of warriors, fingers tightening on weapons, the collective held breath of men ready for violence. Then Chief Naalnish did something unexpected. He smiled. The chief spoke in Apache, and this time his words carried a different tone, warmer, more respectful. Ayana's translation came with barely concealed relief. "My father says you are either very brave or very foolish, but either way, you are honest. He says a man who offers his weapon shows he values honor above life." But Takoda wasn't finished. He spoke rapidly, angrily, pointing at Jake and then at his sister. His words brought tension back to the circle like a physical force. "My brother challenges the debt," Ayana translated, her voice tight with worry. "He says if you truly want no reward for saving me, then you should have no objection to combat. One warrior against another, to settle the question of honor." Jake looked at Takoda, younger, faster, and undoubtedly more experienced in hand-to-hand combat than any white rancher. It was a challenge designed to end with Jake's death and give Takoda the war he wanted. "What kind of combat?" Jake asked. Takoda smiled coldly and drew his knife, a wicked blade with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use. He spoke again, and Ayana translated reluctantly, "Knives. To first blood or death, winner's choice." Chief Naalnish spoke sharply to his son, clearly disapproving, but Takoda stood his ground. The challenge had been made in front of all the warriors. To back down now would shame him, but to proceed would likely end with Jake's death and the war Naalnish was trying to avoid. Then Ayana stepped forward and spoke in Apache, her voice carrying across the valley with surprising authority. The effect on the assembled warriors was immediate. Murmurs of surprise, shifting stances, and most telling of all, a look of shocked respect from her father. "What did you say?" Jake asked quietly. "I claimed the right of substitute," Ayana replied, her jaw set with determination. "Apache law says a woman may fight for someone who saved her life if she judges him worthy of that sacrifice." Takoda's face went purple with rage. He shouted at his sister, but she replied calmly, never breaking eye contact with him. Around the valley, Jake could hear the warriors talking among themselves. Clearly, this was not a common occurrence. Chief Naalnish raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of final judgment. "My father says the challenge stands," Ayana translated, "but he accepts my right to substitute. If I win, the debt is settled, and you are considered a friend to our people. If I lose—" She didn't finish the sentence. Jake stared at her in shock. "You're not fighting your own brother for me. I won't allow it." "You cannot stop it," Ayana replied simply. "The challenge is made, and Apache honor demands an answer. Would you have me dishonor my father before all his warriors?" As Jake watched this magnificent woman prepare to risk her life for his, he realized that saving her from drowning had been the easy part. The real test of courage was just beginning. The circle formed naturally, warriors flowing down from their positions on the ridges like water finding its level. Jake found himself standing beside Chief Naalnish, both men watching as brother and sister faced each other in the center of the ring. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the dusty ground. Takoda moved with the fluid grace of a natural fighter, his knife reflecting the sunlight as he tested its balance. But Ayana was no helpless victim. She drew her own blade, a smaller but equally sharp weapon that she handled with obvious skill. Her movements were economical, precise, betraying years of training that Jake hadn't suspected. "She's done this before," Jake murmured. Chief Naalnish nodded grimly. "Ayana is my daughter. but she is also Apache. All Apache must know the warrior's way, even the women. But Takoda, he shook his head sadly. Takoda fights with anger. Anger makes mistakes. The siblings circled each other, speaking in low tones that only they could hear. Whatever Ayana was saying, it was making Takoda increasingly agitated. His responses came through gritted teeth, his grip on his knife tightening until his knuckles showed white. Then Takoda lunged. His attack was swift and vicious, aiming for his sister's heart. But Ayana wasn't there when the blade arrived. She had pivoted away, her own knife flashing out, to leave a thin red line across Takoda's forearm. First blood to Ayana. The watching warriors murmured their approval. In Apache culture, the first cut was significant. It demonstrated skill, control, and honor. But Takoda's face only grew darker with rage. "Enough!" he snarled in English, surprising Jake. "You shame our father fighting for this white dog." "I fight for honor, brother," Ayana replied, also in English, ensuring Jake could understand. "Something you have forgotten in your thirst for war." Takoda's second attack came from a different angle, a sweeping slash meant to disarm her. Ayana caught his wrist, redirecting his momentum and sending him stumbling past her. She could have struck then, could have ended the fight, but she held back, and Jake realized she was trying not to seriously hurt her brother. That restraint nearly cost her everything. Takoda spun with surprising speed, his elbow catching Ayana in the temple. She staggered, momentarily stunned, and Takoda pressed his advantage. His knife descended toward her chest, only to be blocked by her blade at the last possible moment. The impact drove her to one knee, but she held the lock, muscles straining against her brother's superior strength. "You grow soft, sister," Takoda growled, bearing down with all his weight. "Living too long with peaceful words instead of warrior's truth." "And you grow foolish, brother," Ayana replied through gritted teeth, mistaking cruelty for strength. They held the deadly embrace for long seconds, neither giving ground. Then Ayana did something that caught everyone by surprise. She smiled. "You always were too proud, Takoda," she said, and suddenly shifted her weight, using his own momentum to throw him over her shoulder. Takoda hit the ground hard, but rolled away before Ayana could follow up. Both fighters were breathing heavily now, sweat mixing with the dust on their skin. But Jake could see the fight was changing. Ayana's initial restraint was giving way to the realization that her brother truly meant to kill her if necessary. The next exchange was faster, more desperate. Takoda had abandoned technique for fury, slashing wildly at his sister. Ayana gave ground, her movements becoming purely defensive as she looked for an opening that wouldn't require her to seriously wound him. Then Takoda made the mistake his father had predicted. In his rage, he overextended on a thrust meant to end the fight. Ayana stepped inside his guard, her knife finding the soft spot just below his collarbone. Not a killing blow, but one that sent him to his knees, gasping and defeated. The circle of warriors fell silent. Ayana stood over her brother, knife ready, awaiting his surrender. But Takoda's eyes burned with undiminished hatred. "Kill me then," he rasped. "Prove you are more white than Apache." For a moment, Jake thought she might do it. The blade trembled in her hand, and he saw the war between love and duty playing out across her face. Then Ayana did something that surprised them all. She threw down her knife. "I will not kill my brother for the honor of any man, white or Apache," she declared, her voice carrying to every warrior in the circle. "But neither will I let hatred poison our people's future." Takoda stared at her in shock. By Apache law, he was defeated. His life was forfeit. But Ayana had chosen mercy over victory, compassion over custom. Chief Naalnish stepped into the circle, his weathered face unreadable. He spoke in Apache, his words formal and ceremonial. The assembled warriors listened in absolute silence. "He says the combat is finished," one of the elder warriors translated for Jake. "Ayana has won by combat and by wisdom. The debt is settled. You are considered a friend to the Apache people." But Takoda wasn't finished. As his father spoke, he reached for a hidden knife at his boot, a last, desperate attempt to salvage his honor through treachery. Jake saw the movement before anyone else. Without thinking, he lunged forward, tackling Takoda just as the blade left his hand. They hit the ground together, struggling for control of the weapon. The fight was brief but vicious. Takoda was wounded and exhausted, while Jake was fresh and desperate. When the dust settled, Jake had the knife and Takoda lay pinned beneath him, breathing hard, but alive. "Enough!" Chief Naalnish commanded, his voice cutting through the morning air like thunder. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his words harsh and final. Ayana translated, though Jake could see the pain in her eyes. My father says Takoda has dishonored himself by attempting treachery after defeat. He is banished from the tribe until he can learn what honor truly means. Takoda's face went white. For an Apache warrior, banishment was worse than death. But as Jake helped him to his feet, he saw something else in the young man's eyes. A flicker of shame, perhaps even understanding. Go, Chief Naalnish said in English, addressing his son directly. When you have learned the difference between a warrior and a killer, you may return. Takoda looked around the circle of warriors, many of whom had been his friends and followers. None met his eyes. Finally, his gaze settled on Jake. You have won this day, white man, he said quietly. But winning one battle does not win the war. There doesn't have to be a war, Jake replied. That's the point. Takoda studied him for a long moment, then walked to his horse without another word. As he rode away toward the mountains, the assembled warriors began to disperse, their purpose fulfilled. Chief Naalnish approached Jake, extending his hand in the white man's custom. Jake Morrison, he said carefully, you are welcome in Apache lands. My daughter's life was well saved. As they shook hands, Jake realized that what had started as a simple act of kindness had become something much larger. The debt of honor had been paid, but more than that, a bridge had been built between two worlds that had been drifting toward war. Ayana stood beside them, her knife wound already being tended by one of the elder women. She met Jake's eyes and smiled, an expression that promised this story was far from over. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at Jake's ranch, and the Arizona Territory had settled into an uneasy but genuine peace. The story of the white rancher who saved Chief Naalnish's daughter had spread through both communities, becoming the foundation for cautious cooperation between Apache and settler. Jake stood on his porch in the early morning light, watching a familiar figure approach on horseback. Ayana had taken to visiting the ranch twice a week, initially to help establish trade agreements between her people and the local settlers, but increasingly for reasons that had little to do with diplomacy. Good morning, Jake Morrison, she called as she dismounted, using the formal greeting that had become their private joke. Morning, Ayana, he replied, unable to suppress a smile. Over the months, her English had improved dramatically, while he had learned enough Apache to conduct basic conversations. More importantly, they had learned to read each other's silences, to understand the thoughts that needed no words. She carried a leather satchel that Jake recognized, trade goods from her people, woven baskets, silver jewelry, and ceremonial pottery that the merchants in Tucson paid handsomely for. In return, Jake provided tools, cloth, and other manufactured goods that made Apache life easier without compromising their independence. My father sends his regards, Ayana said as they walked toward the cabin, and news from the territorial governor. Jake poured coffee for both of them, a ritual they had established during her visits. What kind of news? The kind that could change everything, she replied, settling into the chair across from his rough-hewn table. The governor wants to establish a formal trade agreement between the Apache Nation and the territorial government. He wants you to be the official liaison. Jake nearly choked on his coffee. Me? I'm just a rancher. You are the man who proved that Apache and white can work together, Ayana corrected. You have trust from both sides. That makes you more valuable than any politician. It was true, Jake realized. Over the past months, he had become an unofficial ambassador, helping resolve disputes, facilitating trade, and preventing the kind of misunderstandings that had led to conflicts in the past. Other ranchers sought his advice when dealing with Apache boundaries, while Apache families brought their concerns about white encroachment to him for resolution. What does your father think about this? Jake asked. Ayana's expression grew more complex. He thinks it is a good opportunity for our people, but he also thinks, she paused, choosing her words carefully, that such an arrangement would require you to spend much time in our territory, living among us for months at a time. Jake met her dark eyes, reading the unspoken question there. Over the months, their relationship had evolved from gratitude and respect into something deeper, something that defied the cultural boundaries that should have kept them apart. And what do you think about that? He asked quietly. I think, Ayana said, leaning forward slightly, that a man who would risk his life for a stranger might also be brave enough to risk his heart for a friend. Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Through the window, they could see a small group of riders approaching, not Apache, but white men from town. Jake recognized the mayor, the sheriff, and several prominent businessmen. Trouble? Ayana asked, noting Jake's expression. Maybe. Stay inside until I see what they want. But Ayana shook her head. If this concerns the trade agreement, it concerns me too. We face this together. They walked out onto the porch as the delegation dismounted. Mayor Patterson, a portly man with political ambitions, took the lead. Morrison, he began without preamble, we need to talk. Morning, gentlemen, Jake replied evenly. What brings you all the way out here? This business about you becoming some kind of Indian agent, Sheriff Williams said bluntly. People in town are concerned. What kind of concerns? The kind where they wonder whose side you're really on, Patterson said. You've been spending an awful lot of time with the Apache. Some folks think you might be getting too friendly with the enemy. Jake felt his temper rise, but Ayana's presence beside him helped him stay calm. The Apache aren't the enemy, Mayor. They're our neighbors. Neighbors who were killing white settlers just a year ago, businessman Henry Crawford interjected. And now you want us to trust them with official trade agreements. I want you to give peace a chance, Jake replied. The alternative is more bloodshed, and nobody wins that war. The delegation exchanged glances. It was clear they had discussed this before arriving. Here's the thing, Morrison, Patterson said. The territorial governor may want you as his liaison, but the people of this county want someone they can trust, someone who remembers which side he's on. I'm on the side of peace and prosperity for everyone, Jake said firmly. Sheriff Williams stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Maybe it's time you chose more carefully, Jake. A man can't serve two masters. The threat was subtle but clear. Jake was about to respond when Ayana stepped forward, speaking for the first time. Gentlemen, she said, her English formal and precise, I am Ayana, daughter of Chief Naalnish. I speak for my people in this matter. The delegation looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting to deal directly with an Apache woman. The trade agreement benefits everyone, she continued. Apache goods bring good prices in your markets. Apache knowledge of the land helps your ranchers find water and avoid dangerous areas. Apache peace means your families sleep safely at night. What does Apache war bring you? Mayor Patterson cleared his throat. Well, that's not really the point, miss. The point, Ayana said firmly, is that Jake Morrison has brought more prosperity and safety to this territory in 3 months than your politicians have in 3 years. You would be fools to reject such success because of old fears. Her words carried an authority that surprised even Jake. This wasn't just the woman he had saved from drowning. This was a leader, a diplomat, someone capable of bridging the gap between worlds. Sheriff Williams looked skeptical. And what guarantee do we have that your people will honor any agreements? The same guarantee you offer, Ayana replied. Our word backed by our actions. Jake Morrison risked his life to save mine. I risk mine now to save his reputation. That is how trust is built. One brave act at a time. The delegation fell silent, clearly unprepared for such a direct and eloquent response. Finally, Mayor Patterson spoke up. We'll need time to consider this. Of course, Jake said. But while you're considering, remember that peace is more profitable than war, and cooperation serves everyone's interests better than conflict. As the delegation rode away, Jake and Ayana stood together on the porch, watching them disappear over the ridge. Think they'll come around? Jake asked. Some will, others never will. But enough will choose wisdom over fear, Ayana replied, and we will build on that foundation. Jake turned to look at her, this remarkable woman who had changed his life simply by needing to be saved. When you said I might be brave enough to risk my heart, I meant, Ayana said, stepping closer to him, that some risks are worth taking. Some bridges are worth building, no matter how impossible they seem. As the sun reached its zenith over the Arizona territory, Jake Morrison took the biggest risk of his life. He kissed Ayana, daughter of Chief Naalnish, sealing not just their personal bond, but representing hope for a future where two peoples might truly become one community. 6 months later, Jake Morrison was officially appointed as territorial liaison to the Apache Nation. His ranch became a meeting ground where disputes were settled, trades were negotiated, and friendships were forged. And when he married Ayana in a ceremony that honored both Apache and white traditions, their union became a symbol of what was possible when courage overcame prejudice. Takoda eventually returned from his banishment, humbled and wiser, to serve as one of his brother-in-law's most trusted advisors. The peace they built together lasted for generations, proving that sometimes the most important rescues happen not in raging rivers, but in the quiet moments when people choose understanding over fear. The story of the rancher who saved a giant Apache woman from drowning became legend, but the real story was simpler and more profound. It was about the courage to see a person in need as simply a person in need, and the willingness to build bridges where others saw only barriers. In the end, Jake Morrison's greatest rescue wasn't pulling Ayana from the Rio Grande. It was helping rescue two peoples from the hatred that threatened to destroy them both.